Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 18. A Blur. It's true, there are worse crimes that a 10-year-old could commit at school, but to Sophie, this was huge. She zoned into the girls' toilets and looked at her avatar in the mirror. Even that looked tired, and that was programmed to not change its physical appearance. She tried to splash water on her face, but felt nothing. In a complete daze, she exited the bathroom and made her way down the corridor towards the classroom. Fortunately, she didn't see anyone, but heard some commotion coming from the reception area. Thinking nothing of it, she carried on. Eventually, she reached the classroom. Without hesitating at all, she opened the door and simply walked back towards her seat like nothing had happened. The class were deathly silent and just stared at her, but Sophie was so transfixed that she couldn't feel the heat of their eyes. She just carried on heading towards the chair she had abandoned just 10 minutes ago. When she reached it, she picked up her pencil again and simply carried on with the work that she had barely started when Kingsley had walked in. Nobody else moved. The children of Pinkleton Primary were not used to children defying adults and ignoring instructions. This was uncharted territory for everyone, children and adults. It was while she was working that Mrs. Phoenix, who had sat amongst the children during Sophie's return as aghast as any of them, made her way towards Sophie. Sophie, however, didn't notice her at all, nor did she feel Yasmin kick her chair to alert her to Mrs. Phoenix coming, nor Clara asking Mrs. Phoenix a question to distract her from her cousin's arrival back in the room. Sophie didn't look up from the work she was doing. She was completely engrossed in it, as it provided the perfect distraction and return to reality that she needed. A few seconds later, she felt a hand on her shoulder and heard a voice whisper in her ear, "I've spoken to Mrs. Jones. We will all talk at break time." Sophie heard the sounds and they registered in her ear, but she wasn't listening. Part of her wanted to scream at the top of her voice that she hadn't wanted to defy Mrs. Phoenix, but she had to help someone who could be in a huge danger, whereas the other part of her just wanted to work and forget it ever happened. Completely baffled by yet another new feeling, Sophie continued to work in silence until break time, despite the repeated attempts to distract her by Yasmin and Clara, who just wanted to make sure she was okay. After a few minutes of stone-cold silence, the classroom returned to its normal murmur of slight noise. Children returned to work and pencils returned to paper. Sophie, however, just continued to work by herself, free from any potential distraction that the slightest raised noise level would provide. When the lesson finished and everyone was told to put stuff away, Sophie did exactly as she'd been asked and done the most work out of anyone in the class. Books and pencils away, Sophie returned to her seat and Mrs. Phoenix dismissed everyone else for break time. Sophie didn't move. She heard a voice that sounded remarkably like Clara's say in her ear, "Good luck, we're outside when you want us." But Sophie just shrugged at the sound of it and caught a glimpse of Clara and Yasmin dragging Kingsley out onto the playground. When the classroom was emptied and the room had returned to the eerie silence that newly empty classrooms have, Sophie heard the door open and before she knew it, 2 people sat opposite her at the table. "How are you, Sophie?" Mrs. Jones's voice asked softly. Sophie just stared forwards and didn't reply. "We aren't cross. We just want to know why you walked out," the voice came again. Sophie just shrugged. "I needed the toilet," she replied, barely above a whisper. "You know you can't just walk out. Mrs. Phoenix would have to give you permission." Sophie nodded. "I know. I'm sorry," she replied, still barely above the quietest whisper. "Is there anything you'd like to tell us about things at home?" Mrs. Jones asked. Sophie's long-distance stare was suddenly refocused on the 2 adults in front of her. "Yes?" asked Mrs. Jones, knowing that she had found a way into the lost child. "I don't think so," Sophie replied in the closest to her normal voice so far. "Okay," nodded Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Phoenix was still sitting there with a pencil and paper noting something down. "Is everything okay with your mum and dad?" Sophie nodded. "Dad is at home a lot, and Mum goes out a lot," she replied. "They only have 1 implant between them now." "And how does that make you feel?" Mrs. Jones asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "Scared," she replied, finally meeting Mrs. Jones's eye and finally getting the distraction at home to register with herself. "Why?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Because we haven't got much money, and I don't know where Mum is or why she always seems to be poorly," Sophie answered. Mrs. Phoenix was still scribbling away. "Do you talk to Mum and Dad about it?" was Mrs. Jones's next question. "Mum isn't in much. She goes out in the evenings, and Dad falls asleep in front of the television," Sophie said. Mrs. Jones looked at Mrs. Phoenix as she continued to write. "Who looks after Lizzie?" Mrs. Jones then asked. Sophie thought for a minute. "I put her to bed and give her breakfast, tea, and her midnight bottle." "Is that what happened this morning?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Yes," Sophie replied. "Where was your mum and Dad?" "I think Mum was in bed, and Dad was getting his own breakfast. He did try and feed Lizzie some toast, but she wouldn't eat it," Sophie replied. "How do you feel about that, Sophie?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Tired," Sophie replied, "but I love talking to Lizzie and playing with her." "Do you put her to bed every night?" Mrs. Jones continued to question, but smiled at the knowledge that Sophie loved her sister. "Yes, almost every night. I cook her tea as well, but I enjoy it. It means I get to talk to someone." "You can talk to me, Sophie, if you want. You can tell us anything, but we might not be able to keep it secret, but we will try to always believe you." Mrs. Jones smiled the kindest smile Sophie had ever seen her give. The smile prompted Sophie to snap back into reality. There was no way any adult would believe her. She had tried to get people to talk about the old days, but nobody ever would. Years of reading it as stories and old newspapers with her dad were the closest she'd ever gotten. Why would anyone be interested now? "You wouldn't believe me," Sophie replied with a more aggressive tone. "You have no idea." Mrs. Jones signalled to Mrs. Phoenix to stop writing, implying that the conversation was over. She looked over at Sophie again and changed her tone to one that was slightly firmer, as she now knew she had Sophie's full attention again. "For what you did, you need to miss the rest of break and all of dinner." Sophie nodded and faked a smile of acknowledgement while Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Phoenix walked to the corner of the room and had one of those silent chats that teachers have. She then returned to her staring, back into the middle distance, as the problem she was facing returned to the forefront. She remained like it until the children came back in. Sophie was still flitting between daydreaming and reality. The red light indicating a new message then started blinking, but Sophie was too transfixed to notice or care. As the rest of the morning went on, Sophie started to spend more time in reality, but still a large proportion daydreaming of Mum, Dad, Lizzie and Changelings. She sailed through English after break, working silently and ignoring those around her, namely Yasmin and Clara, who were still desperate to get her attention. By the time dinner arrived and Sophie was forced to sit in the reception area and eat, she was almost out of the state of shock she had put herself in and was beginning to focus on things a bit better. Once again, she had been naughty and done something she shouldn't have done, but she hadn't, strictly speaking, been told off. "I should have been screamed at," she thought to herself. "What exactly do I have to do to get told off?" It was thoughts like this that dominated her lunchtime. Finally, seeing rather than simply noticing the flashing red light, which had messages from Clara and Yasmin telling her about Desmeralda, Sophie was about to log in and read the new messages when she heard voices behind her. "You okay?" Clara asked. "Think so," replied Sophie, and Clara noticed she was slightly less out of it than she had been. "Have you been in loads of trouble?" asked Yasmin. "No, they were both nice and just wanted to chat," replied Sophie again. "Well, Miss Sisson said that Desmeralda made it to Scope and that they were sitting around talking," said Clara. "That's all because of you." "Can't tell Mrs. Jones or Mrs. Phoenix that, though, can we?" said Sophie jokingly. Clara and Yasmin both smiled and shook their heads. Then Sophie remembered what she had seen when she reached the school gates in her pursuit of Desmeralda, the group of changelings and other creatures that were roaming the village. "I think she's in danger," Sophie said, looking at them with emotion in her eyes that hadn't been seen since the first thing that morning. "Why?" Clara asked. Before Sophie could reply, a voice echoed from the other end of reception. "Girls, can you please go outside?" It was Mrs. Phoenix. "She has to stay in by herself." Changelings were chasing after her in the village, but she didn't know, Sophie said unbelievably quickly. Clara and Yasmin both pulled faces that resembled, "Are you serious?" before being chaperoned out of the door onto the playground by a dinner-eating Mrs. Phoenix. Sophie quickly logged into her messages while no one was looking and typed out, "They were searching the village while I was looking for her. If they find her at home while she's zoned out and talking to Miss Sissons, I don't know where she might end up." Once again, the drama of what Sophie had done at school was cancelled out by the danger of what was happening in the real world. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.